Hello, welcome to the part 2 of the document understanding series. So in this section, we'll be focusing on document classification. So if you are new to this uh, document understanding section, I do recommend you to go through the document understanding training that we have in the UiPath Academy, and also please go through the part 1 of this series for you to get an understanding about the scenario that we are going through. So once you have covered that, let's continue with the part 2 of this video. So in this part 2, we'll be focusing on the classifying document section. So in part 1, we talked about um, extraction of data. We talked about the document types we have, when we have multiple document types in one file, how we should process them, and we talked about everything in a very high level. So in this section, we'll be focusing purely on classification. So if you remember our scenario, once we identify the document that we need to process, we need to understand what sort of a document it is. For example, if we look at a video, we should know whether it's an invoice, whether it's a purchase order, whether it's any of these documents, and so on. Because the classification is very important to know what sort of data that we need to extract. Without knowing the classification, we would not know whether the data that we are looking for is even available in that document itself. So we will look at how to identify classic the category of the document, and how we should decide whether we need manual intervention to confirm the classification that the robot selects. Once the classification is selected, the robot should copy the files into multiple folders. So for example, in our previous scenario, we had the input files in the input file folder. And once the classification is identified, we should move the documents into process documents folder, and based on the document types and the group and category, the robot should create these folders and copy the file into that folder. So we'll see how we can do that. And if we have multiple types of uh, documents inside one file, we'll see how to split them. So these are the actions that we are going to perform in this section. We'll be using intelligent keyword classifier, and we'll be deciding how to decide whether we need manual classification. The classification is handled through create classification action in action center. We'll see how to use that. Also, if the document has multiple document types such as invoices, purchase orders, and so on, we'll see how to parallel process each classifier we identify, because waiting for one classification to get confirmed is not the best approach. And finally, to perform these additional tasks such as moving the files into different folders, splitting documents, it's handled by a separate process, and we'll see how to build that process and how to invoke them parallelly in our orchestration process. So let's get back to the studio. So this is our orchestration process that we built last time. We worked up until the digitized document section, and we created the taxonomy. We got the API key, and next is the classify document scope to start with the classification. So up to this point, we are inside a loop. Just to recall what we did, we are inside a parallel for each loop, and this will process each document parallelly. So whatever the variables you create should be inside this sequence, because the data those variables hold is unique to each and every document. So the scope of the variables is very important, otherwise it will run into different errors. So getting back to our classification, to start off we should start with the classifying document scope. So this is coming in as a part of the intelligent OCR activities. So when you search for classify, you get a lot of activities. So we are using the classify document scope. So drag it over here, and it asks for different inputs. It asks for the document path, document text, and document object model, and the taxonomy. So we already have this information based on what we did in our previous video. Document path is the file path to locate the document. So basically, if our document is inside input folder, and if you are processing this document, it's the file path for this document. So how should we get it? We have it in our loop. In parallel for each, this doc item holds the file path for each and every document that we are processing. So in here, just like you configure the digitized document data activity, you can provide the doc item variable to the document path. So the document text and document object model is coming from digitized document data as its output, as you see here. So we can include those two variables in classified document scope. The doc text will have the, once you digitize the document, it will, the doc text will have the document as a big string, and the document object model will have the entire document as in a different format. I will show you what sort of format that is later when we get to that point. So it's like a different representation of the same document. Taxonomy, we already created that. And we have output as classification results. So all you need to do is you can get here, press Ctrl K and create a new variable auto classification result. And again, the scope of that variable has to be inside this sequence, process one file. So this output classification result is an array. It's an array of classification results because each document might have different types of documents inside. For example, first page can have invoice, the second page can have a purchase order or a utility bill, and so on. So it will give us multiple classification results. That's why it's inside an array. So once you have configured this section, next is the intelligent keyword classifier. So we have different classifiers as you see here on your left hand side panel. We have the keyword based classifier and we have the intelligent keyword classifier. The difference between the two is, if you have covered the basics, in keyword based classifier, we have to provide the keywords for each document type for it to identify. But in intelligent keyword classifier, we don't need to provide the keywords ourselves. We can train the classifier so that it will identify the keywords by its own. So let's use the intelligent keyword classifier for this section. So drag it over here, and once you drag it, it will look something like this. You have several several things to configure: learning file path and the API key. Learning file path is where that intelligent keyword classifier, the JSON file, is located. So if you see here, it's looking for a JSON file. So this JSON file is not automatically created. We have to create it. So where we can do that is, we can get to our solution folder, go to document processing. You will see the taxonomy JSON over here. Create a new folder. We can say doc classifier. Inside that, you can create another JSON file as intelligent doc classifier. Don't worry about this JSON file for now. Just create a new JSON file. So you will have only one JSON file over here. And if you are thinking about how to create a JSON file, if you have Notepad++, it will be much easier, because you can create a new file, go to language and JSON, and you can save it in that folder as JSON file. This should be empty. And I will show you how a JSON file will look like once it has the data. So this is the file that I already have. It has all the trained information. It will contain the document length, the page count of each document, what type of a document it is, and the score of identifying that as accurate type. So and it says it has the last updated date. Basically, it has a lot of information. You can go through that in the file that I share with you. Okay. So create your empty JSON file, and for learning file path, provide the path to that empty JSON file that you created, just like this. For the endpoint, by default you will get intelligentkeywords.uipath.com as your endpoint. But if you are using the enterprise version, because you might need to use the enterprise version, because we are using AI Fabric and all that. So if you are using the community edition by any chance, you can use this endpoint. But if you are using the enterprise, you can change that URL to this one. So this is what you had earlier. You just need to pass the edition as enterprise. So provide that, and next one is the API key. So I removed my additional intelligence viewer classifier that I included because I wanted to show you how it will look like as soon as you drag it into this. And for API key, you got the API through this get credential activity into document understanding API key, and this variable is of secure string. And the issue we have here is it is expecting the API key in a string format, as you see here. So we have to convert the API key into string. How we are to do that? You can use this command. So it will go to system network credential and convert the document understanding API key into a string. So this will convert that into a string format that this activity is expecting. So once configured, next what you need to do is you need to train the intelligent keyword classifier. So let me show that to you again. So I will create a empty JSON file for now for me to show you that. So then I will save it somewhere. I will save it here just to show you how to do this. And this can be of type JSON. Yes. Okay. What did I say? Oh, hold on. Okay, it's saved this file. Okay, now we'll clear this. And we have an empty JSON file. So that it's in downloads, classifier, and this is our file. So getting back to this one, I will provide the file path to and once you click on manage learning, you will see the screen something similar to this. You will see all the types of documents you have created in your taxonomy, and it will say no training data is available. So what you can do is, if you can expand this, it will say vector 0 words and start training. So what you can do is, you can click on start training and you will get a screen like this. So if you have multiple documents, so if you download the documents I provided in my previous video, you will find several invoices and several account creation forms. And if you get to invoices, you can start training. And in this screen, you can provide all the invoices at the same time. So go into invoices, go to this input folder, selecting all the invoices we have, and click open. And you can select what type of OCR engine you are using depending on what you have used. So in my case it's on the page, and you can click on start training. So it will show you digitizing and training of invoices. It will take some time, and now you can see all the words it has identified for this type of documents, and it says it is trained on 3 files. So each and every time you run this solution, it will automatically train itself, and this number will keep on increasing. So likewise, you can do this for all the types of documents, and it will have your uh, keywords generated, and click on save. Once you do that, and once you get to the JSON file and look at it, you will see the data that I showed you earlier. Okay, so in my case, I will remove this because I already have this configured, and this is my JSON file, and I have the API key as well. And if I go to manage learning, my files are already trained. So for invoices, it's trained by 173 files, and the others are also like similar. So once you do your training, it will look something like this. So that's how you train the intelligent keyword classifier. Now we should specify what document type has to be processed through intelligent keyword classifier by clicking on configure classifiers, and by default in your screen you won't have this tick visible. So click on each tick or the checkbox we have to indicate that we will be using intelligent keyword classifier to process these document types. So I'm using that to process all the documents types that I have. So I'll check that for all types and click on save. We can also use the minimum confidence level if you are using multiple classifiers. And what that means is if it's if the confidence level is less than that, it will use the other classifier. Okay, once you have done that, we have covered the first part, classify document scope. Okay, since we have completed that part, now we'll be looking at how we can use the output of auto classification result that's coming in from the classified document scope to identify whether we need to do the classification manually. So the next action we need to perform is, now as you know, the auto classification result is a array of type classification result. So we need to loop through this array to identify whether there are any classifications that fall below a specific threshold or a specific confidence level where we can identify that as a classification that needs to be verified by someone. So what we are going to do is we'll be using a simple for each activity. So it's not a parallel for each, it's just the for each activity you see here. And I'm using the auto classification result which I got from the classified document scope as the output. And this for each you have to change the type argument to classification result. How you can find this is go to browse and type classification result and you will get it over here. So change it to that type and you will get that for each created for you. Next thing is rename the for each. So by default you will have item over here. So rename it to something meaningful. So what I have here is um, it's file auto classification result, as you see here, because it's for that particular file. So inside that will be looping it for each classification we have in this auto classification result variable, and for each classification file auto classification which is coming from this, we can look for the confidence. So we can find the confidence level over here, and for I'm using an if condition to check whether the classification confidence is less than 0.7. So why I'm doing that is to identify whether how good is the automatic classification is in identifying the type of the document. So what I'm trying to do is if the confidence level is less than 0.7, I will mark it as a classification that require manual verification. So now you remember that we created a variable require manual classification at the very top over here in this multiple assign. So at this point it was set to false. Now based on this condition, if the confidence is less than 0.7, I'm going to change it as true. So which means when this is true, that document has to be verified or classified manually. If it is greater than 0.7, then I'm satisfied with that result and I would take it as the accurate classification. So, so this is that section, and once we execute this part, we would know whether that classification require manual verification or not. So, in if there is a document that has multiple types of uh, documents, basically, if the first page is an invoice and the second page is a purchase order, just like our combined file, what we saw here, the first page is an invoice and the second page is a purchase order. In that case, that loop will check the first classification of this invoice and check whether it's identified as whether its confidence level is greater than 0.7, and it will also check this and see whether the confidence level is above what we have mentioned. If not, if either one goes below 0.7, it will mark it as require manual classification. So again, remember this scope of these variables are in process one file sequence. Okay, so now we have configured this part, and once we obtain that result, then what we are going to do is if this variable require manual classification is true, then we need to um, perform several actions to get the manual classification done. So I'm using another if condition right below this for each with the variable require manual classification. Because this is a boolean variable, I'm not going to say equal true or equal false or anything. By default it should take it. So if this variable has a true value, it should go into the then section of the if condition. If not, it would consider it as we can automatically classify that. Okay, so to handle the manual classification, we are using the action center. So we need to get it classified by the user. We need to create an action or a task in action center, and that's where we are going to use the create document classification action. So if you search for it, you can either search as create or you can search as uh, classification, and you will get those two activities under intelligent OCR actions. The activity is create document classification action. So you can put it here, drag it over this section. So for action title, you can provide any name. Uh, what I have specified here is I'm saying verify classification for the file, and I'm giving the file name. So for example, if I'm to show you how that looks like, if I go to actions, it will look something similar to this. You see here, this is the title, verify classification for and the file. So that's what I'm doing over here. So how you are to get the file name is by this command. So you can say path dot get file name, and remember file path is in doc item, which is our outer loop, the parallel for each, and dot to strings. This will give you the file name with the extension. So that's the action title, and the action priority can be anything as you prefer. I have it as medium, and the action catalog is class verification. You can provide any name as you wish. So if we open one, basically your classification screen will look something like this once it's created. So this is your action. Let's see how we are to create that. So let's get back over here. So the action catalog is marked as class verification. You can have any name over here. You need to place the action folder path, the bucket name. So this is what's important over here. The bucket name is, we have to use the orchestrator storage location to store the data we are going to pass in through these properties over here on your right hand side. The document text, document object model, taxonomy, and the automatic classification result. Why we need to store this in orchestrator is because this action that you create in the orchestrator might be verified sometime later, maybe hours later or days later, depending on the user's availability. So until then, as soon as the user clicks on it, clicks on the action, for the user to see the details, see the document and the classification, the confidence level, that data has to be stored inside the orchestrator. That's why we need to have a storage bucket. So how to create a storage bucket is, once you go into your orchestrator, there is an option called storage buckets. So the additional property you see in the activity is, you have the storage name and the bucket directory path, which means where the storage bucket that you create is located inside the orchestrator. Because we have different folders, we have tenant level, the default, and we have different other areas that we can store. So just like the assets in the get asset activity, we provided the folder path. Similarly, you need to provide that path in here as well for your bucket. So how we should create it? So in my case, it's located in document understanding folder. So you get there, and on the top here you can find the storage buckets. So go there and you can create a storage bucket. So click on this plus sign, and there are different options that you can use: Azure Storage, Amazon, and Orchestrator. So let's take it the easy way. So I'm using the Orchestrator storage bucket. So you just provide the bucket name and a description and click on add. So this will create your bucket as you see over here. So this is my bucket that I have created. And once you have done that, copy that name and paste it over here, and also provide the folder path. If it's inside a specific folder, provide that, and give the document path. And it's again the doc item that's coming from the main parallel for each. Document text is the variable we created when we are creating the digitized document activity, and the document object model, doc taxonomy, and the auto classification result we got from this classifier document scope. So once you configure that part, you get an output as the action output, which is this one. So again, you need to create this variable. You can keep your cursor here, press Ctrl K, and provide the variable name. And again, remember, classification action object, the variable you create, this variable is inside this sequence because it is not required in the process1 file, because this is a wider sequence that handles many things, but this action object is limited to this section. So we can have the scope inside this, because once we get out of this if condition, we don't need this variable anywhere. We actually need this variable only to wait and receive. So wait for the user to reply or complete the action and resume. Once you resume it, it identifies the action through this object. And once you have identified that, we don't need it anymore. So you can have that inside this sequence. Okay. Then you have created your action, and now what you need to do is you need to wait until the user completes it. So how to perform the wait? For that, again, going back to basics, if you remember the classification station or the validation station, if you close it, or if uh, there's another option to report the document as an exception. In either way, if you close it or report it, it will throw an error. So that's why it's not an error, basically it's the error that's user is specifying that it is an exceptional document. So that's why we need to handle that using a try catch. So the first thing after this create document classification action is to use a try catch inside this same sequence right below the create. So place your try catch and use the wait for document classification, which is this activity, and place it over here inside the try part, and you are going to use the action object which you got from the create activity. You place it over here because through that only it's going to identify which action you completed. So put it there, and you can also provide the download directory path if we are allowing the wait activity to download any files. See the description, it says the local directory to be used for downloading the document associated with this action. So you can download the document itself. So I'll show you how this data is stored in that bucket after we discuss about this wait activity. So provide that folder path, and you can also enable or keep this unchecked depending on your requirement. So what it says is remove data from storage, which means once the classification action is completed by the user, when you are resuming, you can clear the data that gets stored in the storage bucket if you think that it is not required anymore. So in my case, I'm not using that. So the data will be stored there permanently until I delete. So do that, and getting back to the right hand side of this action, here you get the validated classification results. So in the first create action, we pass the auto classified result that we got from the classification scope, and we are getting the validated result that's validated by the user. And here in the document path, we are not going to specify the doc item variable. So remember, up until now, we used the doc item that's coming from the parallel for each. But this is the tricky point. So this is part of the parallel for each, which means you cannot override this variable. And sometimes when you go into the suspended mode, so just think of this as separate threads that's running. So you have two documents, you have one thread that handles the same set of activities, and you have another set that handles the same set of activities, but it goes to suspended state because we need to get the classification from the user. And once it resumes, it will not have access to this doc item because it's going to change over time, and it is parallelly accessed. So that's why you cannot use it from this point onwards when you are resuming. So we need to have a separate variable that falls inside this process one file scope, which is the scope of this sequence. So we are going to use a new file, sorry, new variable. We create it, and classify document path is a new variable, and you can see it over here as a string in the process one file. And now you might ask, if we are not going to go for manual verification for the classification, can we use the doc item? Yes, you can, but to keep your workflow simple, if you are not going to manual verification, which means it's going to the else section of this if activity. So in the else part, you can assign the doc item to classified document path, so that from here onwards, the document path will be referred from one variable, so that you don't need to look for doc item variable or the classified document scope based on whether we did the manual verification or not. So just keep it simple. So assign the document path to this variable on both sides, as you see on the screen now. And you get the output as, so if you check the properties, this wait and resume activity gives you several outputs. The document path is one, the document text, taxonomy, object model, and the automatic classification results. All that what you passed in will be returned back to you. So these things you can assign it to the same variable, doc text, object model, and taxonomy. Why? It's because these variables are created in this sequence, process one file, as you see here. The document object model, auto classification result. So reassigning that and overwriting with the validated result will not do any harm to your other documents that's processed parallelly, because these variables will have the data of this particular document, and it's fine to override it because of we are maintaining the scope properly. The only issue comes with the document file path because doc item is a part of that for each loop. So that's why we are going to assign it to a different variable. So if you are maintaining your scopes properly, you can reassign the data that you get after validation into the same variables. So you get the auto classification result as well. And on your right hand side, in the else part, if you don't need the classification to perform manually, we assigned the document item to document classified document path, which is inside this scope, and we need to do another thing. So over here, once it is verified by the user, we assign the validated results into a validated classification result variable, and this variable is also of scope process one file, and it's an array just like the auto classification result. So if it's automatically classified, we should use the same approach, and on the else part we are going to assign the auto classification result to validated classification result, because we can keep it unique and we can keep it simple. So after beyond this point, we'll be accessing the classification data through the validated classifications, because we assume that even though if it's automatically classified or if it's manually classified, we take it as the final and the validated result. So that can be accessed by a different variable. So that's why we are assigning that to validated classification results on both sides. Okay, so in coming back to this try catch, in the tripod you have the wait activity configured now, and in the catch section you are not throwing an error. What you are doing is we are using the variable we created in the first part of the video, classification exception. If you go up here along with the requirement of classification, we have two different variables. Classification exception is assigned to nothing and validation exception is assigned to nothing. We are yet to use this validation exception. So we have come to the point where we are actually using the classification exception. So at the beginning we assigned it to nothing, but over here, if the user report this document as an exception, in the catch part, we are going to assign the classification exception with the exception that is provided by the wait activity. So this exception will basically have the reason or the message that user types in the prompt that he gets when he is closing or reporting it as a exception. So we are assigning that. So if it comes to this point, this variable will not be nothing thereafter. So once you do that, this if section is complete. And next section is, so when before proceeding, we need to identify whether the user reported it as an exception or not. Because if the user reports it as an exception, we are not supposed to process that document, because he don't want it to be processed, and he want that document as an exceptional case. So that's why we are checking this. So right after this if condition we just completed. And remember, if this is automatically classified, we won't be having any exceptions, and that's why we're not using this classification exception on the right side. So after this if condition, we are going to check if this classification exception is nothing, which means if the user did not report the document as an exception, it should be nothing, just like what we assigned at the top. So we are using another if condition to check whether the classification exception is nothing. And if it's not an exception, we are going to perform several other activities around the classification. So again, validated classification result is an array of type classification result, which means if you check that combined uh, document, here you will have two classification results, one for this first page and another for this purchase order in the second page. So that's why we are going to use a for each over here. So before we get into this part, I told you that I am going to show you how the storage bucket looks like. So this is your storage bucket again, and if you click on this, you will see, so by now you won't be having any data because you haven't executed the process yet, but in my case I have some data, so let me show you. So here you can see a bunch of zip files, and you can see some names that's familiar to you in the four files I shared. Can you see the name? So this is that document, and what you see here as DOM is the document object model. The text is the document text. Taxonomy is the taxonomy that we have created. Input results and output results are the data that we inserted and got out of this classification and validations. So if you actually download this, you will see, you will get a set of zip files. Once you open and go inside the taxonomy and open this, it will have the same taxonomy JSON that you have in your project folder, because these details will be uploaded to Orchestrator when you are doing the verification. Okay. And output results and input results will have something like this. It's again a JSON file inside. So basically it will contain the confidence level, the OCR confidence if it has used any OCR, the classifier name, the document bound, start page and end page, how many pages were there in that document, and it will have a lot of information. So that's the output. Uh, Input results, again it's something similar. You can go through this stuff once you do it. And encoded will have a text file. This will be in a encoded format. You won't be able to read anything. And the document object module is again a JSON file. It will look something like this. So you can see the document name and the type as PDF, the language over here, and different structures of the document, those things. And you can also see some confidence levels mentioned, OCR confidence, and so on. So it will have a lot of data. Okay. Okay, so getting back to the workflow. Now what we are going to use is, if the classification is nothing, which means if it doesn't have any exception, we are going to perform several actions. So what we are going to do is, we need to copy these documents, the document that we process from here, to a folder called process documents. We created an asset that holds this file path, and inside this we have to create the folders based on the taxonomy group. This is the group and the category, and based on the document type we need to create a folder and paste the document inside that folder. And if the document has multiple types inside, that document has to be split into different folders. So how we can do that is, we can again uh, parallel process this part, because it's not dependent on each classification you see in the array. So we can do another parallel for each to make it more efficient. So that's why I'm again using a parallel for each over here inside this if condition. I'm using parallel for each for validated classification result, and the type of this is classification result. And I'm going to change the item that you get here by default as each classifier. So I'm going to process each classifier you see inside this array parallelly, and inside this we are going to do a lot of things. So everything that we do beyond this point will be inside this parallel for each, even the data extraction. Why is that? Because getting back to our same document, in the input files, uh, this combined file. So always I'm referring to this point. So in this document, once we classify it, we will have two classifiers, and in our array we will have two elements holding the classification for this invoice and another classification for this purchase order. So we can process these two parallelly, because this invoice is not dependent on this purchase order, and purchase order is not dependent on the invoice. So that's why we are using parallel for each. And for each classification in this document will be performing several actions, including the moving files to that folder. And once you have completed that, we are going to do the data extraction, which is in the next part of the video. So In this part, we'll be focusing on how we can create the workflow to move the files. So before getting there, use a parallel for each over here and use the validated classification result and change it to each classifier. And now moving the documents and splitting the documents. To perform that, we need to do different things. So that will have a lot of activities. So what we can do is we can have a separate process that we can execute parallelly to this main process, what this orchestration process that we are building. So how to do that? You can open a new studio and create a new solution which can be of this can be a blank process. So create a new solution in a different folder, and once you create the solution, go to settings and mark this as start in background. Why we are going to do that is because we need to process this whatever the task that we have here parallelly to what our main process that we are going to run, because the main things happen in that process, and these are the additional stuff that we need to do along with the document understanding steps. So mark it as start in background, and if you actually get back to our main process and go to settings, here you will see that this process starts in the background and it also supports persistence because we created the orchestration process. Okay, so in our new process, here by default you will see only one file. So rename your main file. You can right click on it and rename it as organize classified documents. Because what we are going to do here is to organize the files. And in this workflow, for arguments, we are going to include several arguments. One is the document classifier, which is a string. So I will explain what these are, and the document path, the storage location, and segment classification result. So what this information is, if you get back, I want to show you. So I'll explain what these actions are after some time. So these are the parameters that we created in document classifier, which means it gives you the type of the document, which is this type. You can find if you go to taxonomy manager, if you click on invoice, this is your type. So it will give you finance, incoming, and invoices. So this is the path that we need to create our folders over here. We need the finance, we need incoming, and we need the other type depending on the type we select, as you see here. So that's what we are going to pass in to our new process workflow. So it can be a string. So here you can add those arguments. Document classifier is a string. Document path is going to be where the document is currently stored, the path that user provided in the input file folder. In storage location is from where you need to store the documents. So this storage location will be the path we created in the asset over here, uh, the process documents, doc storage path. So we'll be providing that. And in segment classification results means, so in our main solution, we are inside another for each now. So we are passing the classification of that particular item in the for each. So that's why this is of type classification result and it's not an array because it's one type. So once you pass that in, and you can also pass the document category that you can obtain from the type ID, whether it's an invoice, purchase order, or anything. You can do that as well. So if you want, you can have this out argument as well, because that can be used later in our main workflow. So once you do that, now here in document, here we are going to use uh, assign, because we need to identify, we need to separate the document class. So as you saw in the taxonomy, this type is separated by a simple dot in the middle. So for us to get this path, we need to separate this string by this dot and handle those separately. So that's why we are passing in the full string inside this, and we are going to separate it by the dot, and we'll be splitting it by that, and we'll be saving that into another string array called classify path, as you see here. And what is the document category? It's the very last element of the string, because that's the one that has whether it's invoice or purchase order or other types. So if you are going to output that, you can directly generate your output to out document category argument we just created using this array. It's easy. All you need to do is you can specify uh, the element location as the length of this array minus 1, which points to the very last element in that array, and it will return the category of your document. Okay, so now we have our storage path, which is the root folder that's coming from our asset, and that's until the point of this process documents, this part, and I'm assigning that to a new variable over here, because now using this variable I need to build our folder path. So getting a notepad, and this is the path that we get from our asset, and that's what I have assigned to this copy folder path. And in our for each, because now here we split the document type that we get using that dot, and using that I'm going to build my folder. So for each element inside that array, I'm going to use a assign and value, and I'm going to add that folder path or that element to our main folder path. So this is our main folder path. So for this I'm going to assign this item. So I have that last slash in our asset, as you see over here. So I'm going to add this item. So what will happen is once I add it, it will look something like this, because the first one is the finance, and I will keep on doing it. Once I add it, I'll use that to check whether that folder path exists, and if it does not, I create that folder, and that's how this finance folder is created. And likewise, I will loop again inside this for each, get the next element, which will be the incoming. So this is what you will have inside this copy folder path, and I will be adding the incoming from the sign, and again I will be checking whether that folder exists, and I will create it. And similarly, the next one, based on the document type, whether it's invoices, purchase orders, or anything, I will check for that folder path and I will create it. And once you have created that, you have the folder path to copy your documents inside. And next thing is, now we have several things to do. Now we can have documents which are in PDF format that has multiple pages with different types, and we might have PDF files that has only one document inside it, and we also have images, as you see here. So if it's a PDF file, we need to check where this document is available in the PDF file, in which page, and we need to get that page range and create our file inside the folder that we created. So for example, if we are processing this from combined file which has two types, I need to get the first page and extract only the first page and put it inside the invoice folder, and I need to get the purchase order and get only this page and put it in the purchase order folder. So if I have to show you, if I go to incoming and invoices, I have the combined file which says invoice. So this document has only the invoice, and if I go to purchase order, here I have the combined file that has the purchase order, and I don't have the invoice there. This split you need to do. So how to do that? Um, for that, we first need to identify what type of a document it is, basically using the extension. Okay, so how we can check the file type is using the path.get extension, and I'm using the path.get extension in document path, which will actually give where the document is placed at the moment in the input file folder, and I'll be converting that to uppercase and checking whether it's a PDF file. So I'll be using .pdf to check, because if it's a PDF file, then we need to check in which page this document is in. If not, we can just copy the file into our destination folder. So using this condition, If it's a PDF file, I'm using the UiPath.pdf activities. Okay, so here we need to include several other dependencies as well. So since this is a blank process that we created, we will have Excel activities, mail, system by default. Additionally, we are going to include UiPath document understanding and mail activities and intelligent OCR activities. So up until now, we didn't use any of these activities to organize these files, but it will be used later. So it's good that you have added them right now. So include those two and also add UiPath PDF activities to use it if it's a PDF file. So if it's a PDF file, I'm going to check in which page my currently classified document is in and extract that page and create a new PDF file inside our destination folder. So I'm using the extract PDF range, this activity, place it over here and provide the in document path, uh, which is where the file is currently in, the full file path of the PDF file to be read, and the output file name. This we need to provide where we need to place the file. So basically, now in copy folder path, as we created that over here, it will have the full folder path to the point where we need to create the file. So for example, if it's a purchase order, this variable will have this folder path. So it's the purchase order, and in here I will be using that copy folder path, and I need to include the file name without the extension, as we see here in the input folder. So this depends on how you need to show your file name in your destination. You can configure this as you need. So I'm using the combined file. So that's the file name that I'm getting by this path.get file name without extension, and underscore. I'm going to say what type of a document that is. So remember, if it's a document like this, where you have multiple pages with two different types, we'll be processing one page at a time. So one page will have one classification, the second page will have another classification, and that will be stored in the array as I explained earlier. So we are processing that parallelly. So both pages will process parallelly. So, so inside this, we'll be using the activities to handle one uh, file or one page, and that will be executed parallelly for all the pages we are going to process. Just like earlier, we discussed how multiple files are going to process parallelly. So I'm going to include the document category that we obtained from the top, which will include whether it's a purchase order, invoice, or anything else. And I have included the time in the document name and the extension at the end. So basically this combination would look something similar to this. to show it to you is in a easy way. You have the file name and you have the type of the document and the date and the time. Okay, and the one last thing we need to do here is we need to identify in which page this document is in, and that's where the range property comes in. So in this section, this is why we are getting the argument, the classification result that's coming from that parallel for each in our main solution. In each classification result, if we get to document bounds that we see over here, and if we get the start page, it will say from which page that particular classification is starting. So if it's the first page, if it's the first page in this document, the start page will return you 0 because in programming it starts from 0. And if it's the second page, start page will return you 1. So that's how you identify the page range. So over here, I'm having the start page and I'm adding 1 is because it's starting from 0. Because in the actual PDF file that will not have a 0th page, so it will start from 1. So I need to add 1 to locate the first page. And this expects a string, that's why I'm converting that to a string. So I'm going to specify the range in this format. It should be something like this or something like this. Now with the dash, I'm going to locate the last page. So now we know the start page is starting from 0 and the page count will return the number of pages available in the document. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the start page to the page count, and that will return me the last page of the range that I need to extract. So this will return the range I need to split the document into multiple files. Using that, I'll be splitting the documents into different folders, and that's how you actually split the document using the classification result. And if it's an image or some other format other than PDF, we can simply use the copy file and provide the where the file is currently in, and we can provide the destination folder just like you did over here, and you can enable override in case it's going to have the same name. So that's how you split, and that's how you move the files in from one folder to another based on the classification result. So how we are going to execute this, because this is in another separate solution. So we can execute this parallelly, or we can execute this as a part of our main process. But we need to remember one thing. We can execute this parallelly if this process is not running as an unattended process, which means if this is an unattended process, you cannot run parallel processes. You cannot basically invoke processes parallel to that process from an unattended process. So how do you define whether it's an unattended process or not? So basically, if, for example, in this case over here, if you do not get into this create action and wait action, that means you can invoke it parallel. But at the very point you get into this section, you create an action and wait for it, that's going to be an unattended process. Because once it resumes automatically. No one is going to trigger it. And it resumes in an unattended mode from the wait activity. So once, if it's a resumed process from this point, you won't be able to invoke that other process parallelly. So in that case, you need to invoke it as a part of this process. That's why I'm using an if condition over here and checking whether for this particular document whether we had requested manual verification or not. This variable was assigned to true on the top over here. So if it was false, that means if it got verified automatically, then we will execute the process parallelly to improve the efficiency of the process, because those things can handle separate from uh, this particular process. But if it requested manual verification, we have no other choice other than invoking it as a part of this process. So that's why I have this if condition to check whether we need to process it as part of this one or whether we need to process it parallel. So whenever the document is automatically classified, all those documents will be processed or moved to the process documents folder parallel to this process, which improves the efficiency of the entire process drastically. So it's we are using two different activities over here. It's invoke process and invoke parallel process. If it required manual verification, we are using invoke process, and we just need to specify where this process is located. So all you need to do is, once you completed this workflow, save it and publish it into Orchestrator through this publish option. You can publish it into a folder, or you can publish it into the default location and create a process from that, as you see over here. So in my case, it's published in this document understanding. And okay, one second. So in my case, it's published in document understanding as document understanding file process, because that's my process name. And you get to this point, place the process name that you have placed. So ideally that should be the name you see here in the package name. Put that name, and the entry point is going to be your XML file. So you can either provide the XML file path, because for now we'll just provide the file that you need to run, which is our main file anyway. And you also need to specify where this process is, basically the folder. In my case, it's document understanding. And we need to give the arguments. So how we are to give the arguments is, we use the exact names we have in the other process as arguments, as you see over here. So copy these names and place it in the argument list and set the argument types properly, as you see over here. And for document classifier, how we are going to access the classification ID that we saw in the taxonomy manager for that particular document is each classifier, because that's each classifier is coming from the parallel for each. The document type ID will give you that full string. So this document type ID will have a string like, so in our case it's finance in incoming and invoices or anything. That's the format. Okay. So once you provide that, provide the classified document path, which is the current folder path of the document where you want to store it. So this variable document storage path is coming from the outermost sequence, the document storage path, because we are getting that from an asset in the initialized scope. And the document category is being returned to you. But remember, if this is invoked parallelly from this unparalleled process activity, you won't have a value getting into this document category variable that you create. So this variable we are creating right now, it wasn't created earlier. So Control K and you can create it. And remember to set the scope into process one file, as you see over here, document category. It's not process one file, it's process document for each classification, which is this sequence. So from this point onwards, because we are using parallel for each again, those variables that we are using inside here has to be inside this sequence. So keep a close eye on the scope of the variables, because otherwise we will run into different errors. So once you set that, so if this is processed parallelly, you won't be getting any value to this document category, but don't worry about it now. So for invoke process, place the variable over there, and for in segment, for the classification result, use the each classifier you get from the parallel for each. And likewise, if this does not require manual classification, we can parallelly process it parallelly. So you can use the run parallel process, this action, and place it over here. So why I am doing this is to show you how we can invoke different processes depending on the type of this execution. So if it's resumed in an unattended mode, how we should invoke our processes, and if not, how we should invoke our processes parallelly. So you can configure the process name and the entry point as you did for invoke process, and the arguments has to be same as earlier. So this has to be changed to out in my case. So you can change that, and you can also configure the folder path of the process as you did in the invoke process and save it. So now you are able to run this process up to this point and see whether it moves your files and how it classifies your documents, uh, and see how good the process is, whether you have any errors and so on. So I will share the process at the end of the series, or I will share the process in in a shared drive, so you can download and cross check once you have completed that. So that's coming to the end of the classification part. So you can execute and see how it is executed and explore more on the classification. So I will see you in the next video that's focusing on the data extraction after the point of classification. So thank you very much for listening for this long video, and take a break, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.